On the 26th of September, 1868, a 16-year-old boy stood on a railway platform at Heirs station in Kent and tried not to cry. He had already broken down once in the carriage, pale and shaking, and had spent the short journey composing himself before his older brother Henry walked him to the ship that would carry him to the other side of the world. His name was Edward. His father had not come to the station to say goodbye. He had written a letter instead. The letter said, "I need not tell you that I love you dearly, and am very, very sorry in my heart to part with you. But this life is half made up of partings, and these pains must be borne." Edward would never see his father again. His father died less than 2 years later, one of the most celebrated human beings on the planet. Charles Dickens, the man who wrote Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Great Expectations, the man who had taught an entire civilization to feel the suffering of its poorest children, could not bring himself to stand on a platform and wave goodbye to his own youngest son. How does the most famous champion of orphaned and abandoned children in the history of English literature end up sending his own children into exile, debt, and early graves across 4 continents? What you are about to hear has not been told this way before. Stay with it. In the next 40 minutes, you will discover what really happened to Walter Dickens, who died in a military hospital in Calcutta on the last day of 1863, talking about his plans to come home seconds before he bled to death. You will discover that Sydney Dickens, Dickens's 5th son, became so ruinous with money that his own father declared he wished the boy were dead, and Sydney later died alone in the Indian Ocean, buried at sea at 25. And you will discover what Kate Dickens, Charles's daughter, whispered to George Bernard Shaw decades after her father's death. "My father was a wicked man, a very wicked man." What you are about to hear is not a story about Charles Dickens the writer. It is a story about what it costs to be magnificent and who pays the price when you are not the one writing the bill. There is one detail planted here at the start that I will return to at the end. It is the letter, the one that said, "These pains must be borne." Remember it. Charles John Huffam Dickens was born on the 7th of February, 1812, in a rented house at 1 Mile End Terrace in Portsmouth, England, the second of 8 children. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Royal Navy Pay Office, a man of warmth and chronic financial catastrophe, whose talent for spending money that did not yet exist would shadow his son's entire life and, as we will see, the lives of his grandchildren too. The early years were genuinely warm. The family moved often, Portsmouth to London to Chatham in Kent, and Charles read voraciously, worked his way through Tobias Smollett and Henry Fielding and the Arabian Nights, and showed, from almost the first moment he could speak, an appetite for performance. He stood on tables in pubs and sang. He memorized theatrical monologues. At 7 years old, he saw Joseph Grimaldi, the great clown of the age, perform at the Star Theatre in Rochester, and the encounter lit something in him that never went out. Then, in 1824, it all collapsed. John Dickens was arrested for debt and committed to the Marshalsea prison in Southwark, London. The family, following the custom of the time, moved in with him, all except Charles, who was 12 years old and was sent to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, at Warren's blacking warehouse on the Thames, pasting labels onto jars of shoe polish for 6 shillings a week. The warehouse was, by his own description, a crazy, tumble-down old house, literally overrun with rats, its wainscoted rooms rotten, the sound of squeaking and scuffling rising up the staircase at all times. He never forgot it, More than that, he never told his own children about it. They learned the truth of David Copperfield only after his death, when John Forster published the biography on which Dickens had quietly collaborated. This is the childhood scene that contains everything that would follow. A 12-year-old boy, alone, in a rat-infested factory, while his family is imprisoned 2 miles away. His mother, Elizabeth, when the opportunity arose for Charles to leave the warehouse, was, in his own words, warm for my being sent back. He wrote later, "I never afterwards forgot. I never shall forget. I never can forget." The wound of maternal abandonment, of being dispensed with by his own family, ran deeper than anything else in his life. And here is the thing no biography of Charles Dickens has ever fully confronted. He repeated the pattern, not as a villain who chose cruelty, but as a man whose private terror of helplessness and drift was so intense that he could not witness it in anyone near him, including his children. He saw the blacking factory in every son who struggled with debt. He heard his mother's warm endorsement in every child who seemed passive or directionless. And so he did, in the language of a more comfortable century, what his mother had done to him. He dispatched them, first emotionally, then physically, and eventually, for 5 of his sons, to places from which they would not return to England alive. The letter he wrote to his youngest son at that railway platform, "These pains must be borne," was first written to himself in a rat-infested room in 1824. Charles Dickens married Catherine Thompson Hogarth on the 2nd of April, 1836, between the second and third instalments of a serial novel called The Pickwick Papers, that had already begun turning him into a phenomenon. Catherine was 20 years old, the daughter of a Scottish newspaper editor, a warm and steady young woman with dark eyes and a composed manner that suited perfectly the domestic life Dickens was building with furious velocity. They were married at St. Luke's Church in Chelsea and spent a brief honeymoon in Chalk, Kent, before returning to their lodgings at Furnival's Inn to resume the business of becoming the most famous writer in the English-speaking world. The Pickwick Papers sold 40,000 copies in its final instalment alone. Within 2 years, Dickens had also published Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby. Within 5 years, he had crossed the Atlantic and been received in Boston like a rock star, crowds gathering at the docks, letters arriving in sacks from strangers who wrote as though they knew him personally. He was, by the time he was 30, a name recognized in parlors and factories and churches and courts in every country where English was spoken. And the house at Gad's Hill Place in Higham, Kent, which he had dreamed of owning since he walked past it as a penniless boy, the house that was the very emblem of the life he had constructed from nothing, became his in 1856 for the sum of £1,790. Gad's Hill was something, 18 rooms, a tunnel under the road connecting the main house to a detached chalet in the garden where Dickens wrote, a drawing room with painted mirrors and scarlet curtains, a library filled floor to ceiling with false book spines, painted dummies he had made as a private joke, with titles like The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Ignorance, and the Virtues of Our Ancestors, Stodginess. The grounds were wide enough for the enormous group picnics and charades games and amateur theatricals that Dickens staged every summer for his children and their friends, productions that sometimes ran for weeks. At Christmas, the house became a theatre, 10 stockings on the mantel, conjuring, games. His daughter Mary, known as Mamie, later wrote of these Christmases as the defining warmth of her childhood. The magic was real. He was genuinely, completely present in those moments, performing for his children, organising their games, writing stories for them, giving each of them an elaborate nickname. He called the youngest Edward, the Plornischgenter, a word of his own invention, which was shortened in the family to Plorn. He had everything, everything. But beneath the surface, one detail. By the time Gad's Hill was purchased, Catherine Dickens was tired and heavy and quiet in ways that her husband had begun to interpret as personal failures. Within 2 years of moving in, he would meet Ellen Ternan, and within 4 years, Catherine Dickens would be gone. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about Charles Dickens. He was not simply a hypocrite. The man who wrote with such genuine force about the suffering of the abandoned poor, who helped found a home for destitute women, who walked London for hours to clear his head and feel the city that fed his imagination, that man was entirely real. And the man who publicly destroyed his wife's reputation, separated his children from their mother, with a coldness that appalled even his closest friends, and spent 13 years conducting a secret relationship with a young actress, while insisting publicly that the two were strangers. That man was also entirely real. In 1857, Dickens hired professional actresses for a charity production of a play he had co-written with Wilkie Collins, called The Frozen Deep. One of the actresses was Ellen Ternan, who was 18 years old. Dickens was 45. By his own account, he cast her and thought nothing of it. Every account of people who were present suggests something rather different. Within months he was consumed. Ellen Ternan was slight and fair-haired and intellectually ambitious in a way that Catherine, exhausted by 10 pregnancies in 15 years, several miscarriages, and recurring bouts of what modern medicine would recognize as severe postpartum depression, simply could not match in Dickens's relentlessly comparative imagination. Kate, his daughter, later described Ellen with striking clarity. She had brains, which she used to educate herself, to bring her mind more on a level with his own. Who could blame her? He had the world at his feet. The affair was conducted with elaborate and exhausting secrecy. Dickens maintained a second residence for Ellen in Peckham, visited regularly under assumed names, and, this is the detail no contemporary biography wished to fully confront, very likely fathered a child with her in January of 1863, a son who died in infancy. His daughter Kate told George Bernard Shaw about this. Biographer Claire Tomalin pieced together the circumstantial evidence in her work The Invisible Woman, and it is now the standard scholarly position. The son has been called, in Robert Gottlieb's phrase, the 11th child. What Catherine Dickens knew, and when she knew it, has never been fully established. What is established is this. In May of 1858, Dickens published an open letter in the press, announcing their separation and declaring that Catherine had never been a loving mother, words Kate later called the cruelest of his slanders and completely unmerited. Catherine left. She took one child, Charlie, with her, because he had the independence to choose to go. The other 9 stayed with their father. The letter, public, published, irrevocable, did something to every one of those 9 children that no amount of Christmas conjuring and garden theatricals could undo. I told you about Kate's words to Shaw. My father was a wicked man. I will return to that later. There is more to it. Walter Landor Dickens was the second son, born on the 8th of February, 1841, exactly 1 day after his father's 29th birthday. He was named after the poet Walter Savage Landor, because Charles Dickens had a habit of naming his children after the literary and artistic figures he most admired, as though the name itself might transfer something of the greatness. It did not. In most cases, it simply made the gap between the name's owner and the child's eventual fate more painful to contemplate. Walter was sent to the East India Company's Presidency armies at 16, assisted in obtaining his cadetship by Dickens's wealthy friend and philanthropist, Angela Burdett Coutts. He arrived in India in the summer of 1857, sailing into the aftermath of the Indian Rebellion, and fought in it. For a time, he was a lieutenant. For a time, it appeared that Walter Dickens might be the one who made something straightforward of his life. Then the debts began. The pattern was the same one that had destroyed his grandfather John Dickens, and the same one that would appear in Sydney, in Charlie, in Plorn. Walter accumulated obligations he could not honour, fell into money trouble with his regiment, and found himself in correspondence with his family asking for help. His father refused. There is a letter from Walter to his sister Mary, Mamie, in which he wrote that he had resolved to write home no more until he was out of debt. His brother Charlie, passing through India in 1861 on a tea trading venture in Hong Kong, stopped for a fortnight and quietly settled what could be settled. It bought time, not much. By the autumn of 1863, Walter was unwell. Arrangements were made to send him home on sick leave. He arrived in Calcutta from his regiment's station and was admitted to the officers' hospital. And on the 31st of December, 1863, at 5:15 in the afternoon, Walter Dickens was sitting up in his hospital bed, talking with the other patients about his arrangements for the voyage home, excited, apparently, at the prospect of seeing England again, when he suddenly became agitated, coughed violently, and had a great rush of blood from his mouth. The aneurysm in his aorta had burst. He was dead within seconds. He was 22 years old. Now you need to sit with this one moment. Charles Dickens received the news of Walter's death on the 7th of February, 1864, his own 52nd birthday. He described the circumstances to a friend in a letter and said, "I could have wished it had pleased God to let him see his home again, but I think he would have died at the door." What he did not do, according to those who observed him in the following days, was take any formal notice of the event to Catherine, Walter's mother, the woman he had publicly expelled from his own life 6 years earlier. Here is a detail I am planting now that I will not fully explain for several sections. When Walter Dickens's possessions were finally returned from India, what arrived in England was not his belongings. What arrived was his debt. What does a father do with that? The public Dickens of the 1860s was at his most spectacular. He gave dramatic readings of his own work to theatres packed with audiences who wept and fainted and crowded outside for tickets that were being scalped in the street. His performance of the murder scene from Oliver Twist, Bill Sikes killing Nancy, was so physically intense that doctors in the audience documented concern for his health. After each performance, he would be found backstage, drenched in sweat, pulse racing, unable to speak for several minutes. He was, in other words, spending himself. What the audiences did not see was what the readings cost and what was being spent alongside the physical energy. In 1868 alone, Dickens was managing the invisible life with Ellen Ternan. The continued silence on the subject of Walter's death, the ongoing financial distresses of multiple sons, and the private contempt he had begun to express in letters about children he had himself sent away. He wrote of his son Frank, who would become, of all things, a Canadian Mountie, as a good, steady fellow, but not at all brilliant. Of the unborn Plorn, in a letter to a friend before the child's birth, he had written words to the effect that he didn't particularly want him. These were private letters, not published in his lifetime. The children did not know. The reading public absolutely did not know. Here is what no biography has ever fully explained about this period. The double life Dickens maintained was not simply about Ellen Ternan. It was also about his children, He performed the role of devoted father in his letters, in his public persona, and in the Christmas rituals at Gad's Hill, and simultaneously wrote letters to his friends that read like dispatches from a disappointed employer reviewing underperforming staff. He could hold both versions without apparent discomfort, because he was, at his deepest level, a performer. The audience was always changing. The performance was always required. The children who remained at home watched this. Kate, who was the most acute observer in the family, later described the household atmosphere after Catherine's departure with a single sentence: "My father was like a madman when my mother left home. This affair brought out all that was worst, all that was weakest in him." What she meant by "all that was weakest" takes the rest of this story to explain. The sons who were sent abroad, Walter to India, Frank to India, and then Canada, Alfred and Plorn to Australia, were not sent because Dickens was indifferent. They were sent because Dickens was terrified. The blacking factory child who had watched helpless men fail around him all his life, his grandfather, his father's colleagues in the debtor's prison, had built an empire specifically to put that terror behind him. When he looked at his sons and saw the same drift, the same financial incapacity, the same purposelessness, he did not reach toward them. He removed them from his sight. The empire was large. It absorbed a great deal. The public Dickens of the 1860s was at his most spectacular. He gave dramatic readings of his own work to theatres packed with audiences who wept and fainted and crowded outside for tickets that were being scalped in the street. His performance of the murder scene from Oliver Twist, Bill Sikes killing Nancy, was so physically intense that doctors in the audience documented concern for his health. After each performance, he would be found backstage, drenched in sweat, pulse racing, unable to speak for several minutes. He was, in other words, spending himself. What the audiences did not see was what the readings cost and what was being spent alongside the physical energy. In 1868 alone, Dickens was managing the invisible life with Ellen Ternan, the continued silence on the subject of Walter's death, the ongoing financial distresses of multiple sons, and the private contempt he had begun to express in letters about children he had himself sent away. He wrote of his son Frank, who would become, of all things, a Canadian Mountie, as a good, steady fellow, but not at all brilliant. Of the unborn Plorn, in a letter to a friend before the child's birth, he had written words to the effect that he didn't particularly want him. These were private letters, not published in his lifetime. The children did not know. The reading public absolutely did not know. Here is what no biography has ever fully explained about this period. The double life Dickens maintained was not simply about Ellen Ternan. It was also about his children. He performed the role of devoted father in his letters, in his public persona, and in the Christmas rituals at Gad's Hill, and simultaneously wrote letters to his friends that read like dispatches from a disappointed employer reviewing underperforming staff. He could hold both versions without apparent discomfort because he was, at his deepest level, a performer. The audience was always changing. The performance was always required. The children who remained at home watched this. Kate, who was the most acute observer in the family, later described the household atmosphere after Catherine's departure with a single sentence: "My father was like a madman when my mother left home. This affair brought out all that was worst, all that was weakest in him." What she meant by "all that was weakest" takes the rest of this story to explain. The sons who were sent abroad, Walter to India, Frank to India, and then Canada, Alfred and Plorn to Australia, were not sent because Dickens was indifferent. They were sent because Dickens was terrified. The blacking factory child, who had watched helpless men fail around him all his life, his grandfather, his father, his father's colleagues in the debtor's prison, had built an empire specifically to put that terror behind him. When he looked at his sons and saw the same drift, the same financial incapacity, the same purposelessness, he did not reach toward them. He removed them from his sight. The empire was large. It absorbed a great deal. Sydney Smith Haldimand Dickens, the fifth son, was born on the 18th of April, 1847, and named after the wit and clergyman Sydney Smith, whom his father greatly admired. He was a bright, appealing child, and Charles Dickens was genuinely proud of him when, at age 14, Sydney entered the Royal Navy. The pride was real, so was the fall. Sydney rose to the rank of lieutenant. He served on HMS Topaz, and then he did what several of his brothers had already done and would continue to do. He fell into debt. Not moderate debt, reckless debt. His sister Mamie, who had reason to be protective of family members, and generally was, later said she thought of Sydney with contempt and even horror. Those are strong words from a devoted sister. The records suggest that Sydney's money troubles were not merely irresponsible, but genuinely alarming. That at one point, Charles Dickens declared the debt so bad that he refused to allow Sydney into the house. This was not the first time, but it was different in one way. With Walter, the refusal of financial help had been accompanied by a kind of resigned sadness. The war correspondence, the tropical distance, the sense of events beyond anyone's control. With Sydney it was personal and proximate. Sydney was in England, the house was not far, and his father, who had written movingly about the cruelty of closing the door against the desperate and the troubled, closed the door. Within 1868, Dickens wrote something to a friend that biographer Robert Gottlieb discovered and quoted in Great Expectations, The Sons and Daughters of Charles Dickens. He said, in effect, that he wished Sydney were dead. The exact wording was private. The sentiment was not ambiguous. He was 56. His son was 21. Sydney went back to sea. He was invalided out of service aboard HMS Topaz on the 22nd of April, 1872, suffering from severe illness, bronchitis, fever, a body that had been worked hard and given very little rest. He was transferred to the P&O steamer Malta for the passage home from Bombay. He died on the 2nd of May, 1872, at sea in the Indian Ocean. He was 25 years old. There was no land to bury him in. He was buried at sea, and that is where he remains. There is a memorial to him now, at Highgate Cemetery in London. The inscription on it reads, Lieutenant Sydney Smith Haldimand Dickens, 5th son of Charles and Catherine Dickens, born 18th April, 1847, died and was buried at sea, 2nd May, 1872. His father had been dead for 2 years by then. He never knew. After Sydney's death, something clarified in the family. The children were scattering. The pattern was becoming visible. And Kate, in the privacy of her friendships, had begun to articulate what she had understood for a long time. The year was coming when she would say it plainly. The rupture that defined everything came in May of 1858, and it was Charles Dickens himself who made it public. He published an announcement of his separation from Catherine in his own magazine, Household Words, a document that combined selective honesty and calculated cruelty in the way that only a truly gifted writer could manage. He stated that Catherine had never been a fit partner for him, and, in the version that circulated more widely in America, before he could suppress it, he explicitly accused her of being mentally disordered, language he deployed to suggest that her unhappiness was illness rather than reasonable response to her situation. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, reading it, was disgusted. "What a crime," she wrote to a friend. Dickens's own friends were appalled. His biographer Claire Tomalin would later call his public treatment of Catherine the act of a man deranged by passion and self-justification. Catherine left. She went quietly. She took no revenge, gave no interviews, published no letters. She spent the remaining 20 years of her life in relative retirement, visiting with the few children she was permitted to see, corresponding with acquaintance, and, a detail that has only emerged in modern scholarship, carefully preserving every letter Charles Dickens ever sent her. When she died in 1879, she left the letters to the British Museum with the instruction that they should eventually be made public, so the world may know he loved me once. They are there today. The public response to the scandal was instructive. Most of the press chose Dickens. The man was simply too beloved, too powerful, too necessary to the national mythology for the truth to be inconvenient. Catherine was described by contemporaries, influenced by Dickens's own framing, as slow-witted, passive, unsuited. The rehabilitation only came a century later, beginning with Tomalin's work and completed by Lillian Nader's biography, the first full-length study of Catherine Dickens, which established that she was accomplished, intelligent, adored by her children, and simply the victim of a man who had outgrown her in his own imagination and had the cultural power to make that imagination the official record. Now here is what the press was mocking, and the story has never fully confronted. What the papers called Dickens's eccentric domestic arrangements. The sister-in-law Georgina Hogarth installed as housekeeper, the famous wife quietly removed, the young actress in a Peckham townhouse, was not actually the secret. The real secret was simpler. The real secret was what happened to 9 children who were required to take their father's side against their mother, and who spent the rest of their lives carrying the cost of a loyalty that had been extracted from them before they were old enough to understand what they were being asked to surrender. Kate said it most plainly. We were all wicked not to take her part. The children were between 9 and 21 years old when the separation happened. The youngest, Plorn, was 6. In the years between 1860 and 1868, Charles Dickens sent 5 of his 7 sons to distant postings from which most of them would never return. It happened gradually, almost casually, dressed up in the language of opportunity and practical advantage. But the pattern is now unmistakable. Frank Dickens, nicknamed Chickenstalker by his father after a character in The Chimes, was sent first to India to work in a postal role, then redirected after Walter's death to Canada, where he joined the Northwest Mounted Police. He served in that capacity for years, participating in the famous confrontation at Fort Pitt during the Northwest Resistance of 1885. He resigned his commission in 1886 and died the same year in Moline, Illinois, during a lecture tour about his father's life. He was 42. He is buried in the United States. Alfred D'Orsay Tennyson. Dickens, another name borrowed from a famous figure, in this case the poet Tennyson, sailed for Australia in 1865 to work as a sheep farmer and station hand in the outback of New South Wales and Queensland. Alfred managed eventually to carve out something resembling a stable life, married twice, had 2 daughters, and spent his later years delivering lectures about his father across America and Australia. He died in New York City in 1912, during yet another lecture tour. He too is buried outside England. Plorn, Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens, was the last to be sent, and the most painful case. He was 16 years old on the 26th of September, 1868, when his brother Henry walked him onto the ship at Gravesend. At Heirs Station, earlier that day, he had broken down and wept in the railway carriage. He arrived in Australia just before his 16th birthday and worked at Momba Station near Wilcannia in New South Wales, a place of vast, flat, sunburned distance, as unlike the green country lanes and Christmas theatricals of Gad's Hill as it was possible to imagine. He married Constance de Siley in 1880 and borrowed £800 from his brother Henry to invest in Yanda Station near Burke. A bad drought year forced him to sell in 1882. He served as a Member of Parliament for Wilcannia from 1889 to 1894, then lost the seat. He worked at various times as a rabbit inspector. He died in Moree, New South Wales, on the 23rd of January, 1902, from edema. He died in debt. Among his papers, found after his death, and now held by the State Library of New South Wales, is the letter his father wrote him on the day he left England. "I need not tell you that I love you dearly," it begins. "But this life is half made up of partings, and these pains must be borne." Plorn had kept it. For 34 years, across 2 failed stations and a lost Parliament seat, and a continent where no one knew his name except as his father's, he had kept it. The first of the 3 original teasers resolves here. Walter did not simply die in debt. He died talking about coming home. The debt that arrived in England after him was the last communication his father ever received from his second son. Ellen Ternan was born on the 3rd of March, 1839, in Rochester, England. A city that Charles Dickens had loved since childhood, the city where he had seen Grimaldi perform, the city he had always associated with the beginning of wonder. She was 18 when they met. He was 45. She was an actress from a theatrical family, the third of 3 daughters, born to a mother who was herself a working actress. She was small and fair, and by all accounts, genuinely clever. Not the passive recipient of a great man's attention, but someone who understood, with some sophistication, what she was entering. What she gave Dickens that no one else had provided was not beauty or youth alone. It was the sense, as Kate put it, that here was someone who was educating herself to meet him on his own ground. His marriage to Catherine had been made when he was 24 and hungry for domestic stability. By the time he was 45, he had outrun everything that marriage represented. Ellen Ternan gave him a second life, a private life, a life in which the factory boy who had made himself into a national monument could be, for a few hours at a time, in a house in Peckham that few people knew about, simply Charles. What she cost him, and far more precisely, what she cost his children, was the family, not by existing, but by triggering the public rupture with Catherine, the open letter, the forced loyalty test applied to 9 children who were not yet adults and were in no position to refuse. When Kate came to her father's study on her wedding day in 1860 and said goodbye before leaving for the church, Dickens collapsed against the door after she closed it. Mamie, who witnessed it, heard him say, "But for me, Katie would not have left home." He understood. He could not stop. The evidence of the son born to Ellen Ternan in January of 1863 and dead within weeks is circumstantial but substantial. Claire Tomalin assembles it. Claire Garnett corroborates it. Kate Dickens confirmed it to Gladys Story, who published it in Dickens and Daughter in 1939. Dickens's supporters attacked the book. George Bernard Shaw wrote to the Times Literary Supplement to say that Kate had told him everything in it 40 years before the book appeared. Ellen Ternan destroyed every letter Dickens ever wrote her. He, in the summer of 1860, went into a field behind Gad's Hill and burned most of his correspondence in a bonfire that he described to a friend as a matter of practical necessity. The practical necessity was the concealment of a relationship that would have destroyed his reputation had its nature been fully documented. What survived the bonfire was the public record. The public record has been, in almost every respect, his. Only after Ellen's death, and Kate's death, and the deaths of everyone who was present, did the private record begin to surface. Let us account for them, one by one, as the record allows. Charles Culliford Bos Dickens, called Charlie, the eldest, who chose to go with his mother when the separation happened, was the only child who demonstrated that defiance openly. His father saw in him an indescribable lassitude of character that he ascribed entirely to Catherine's bloodline, which was both unfair and revealing. Charlie went to Eton, floundered in business, went bankrupt in 1868 at 31, and was then hired by his father to work at all the year round. After Dickens's death, Charlie inherited the magazine, sold Gad's Hill to pay its debts, and kept it running for years. He wrote travel books. He had a full family life. He died in 1896, at 59, perhaps the most resilient of them, certainly the most publicly dishonoured by his father's letters. Mary Dickens, Mamie, the elder daughter, never married. Her father's separation from Catherine had placed her and Kate in social limbo, daughters of a famous man who had publicly humiliated his wife, which in Victorian England made them delicate commodities. She became peculiar in later life, a spendthrift, a drinker, eventually attaching herself to a clergyman and his wife, who, according to Gottlieb, seemed to be after what money Mamie had. She died in 1896, the same year as Charlie. Kate, who lived to 89, the last of the generation, was the most fiercely alive. She painted, she rebelled, she said plainly what the others could not. She told the truth to Gladys Story, and to George Bernard Shaw, and to anyone else who asked. Her one child by Carlo Perugini, Leonard Ralph, born in 1875, died at 7 months. She buried the grief. She painted children for the rest of her life. Walter, dead in Calcutta at 22, already accounted for. The debt arrives, the body does not. Frank, chicken stalker, died in Illinois at 42. Alfred died in New York at 67, between lecture tours about his father's greatness. Sydney died in the Indian Ocean at 25, buried at sea. His own sister called him contemptible. Henry, Sir Henry Fielding Dickens, the one his father spared from criticism, became a King's Counsel, was knighted in 1922, died in 1933 at 84. He was the longest-lived of all the children. His granddaughter, Monica Dickens, became a novelist, the only descendant of that generation to inherit anything resembling the grandfather's gift with words. Dora Annie, the 9th child, died on the 14th of April, 1851, from convulsions. She was 4 months old, named after the character in David Copperfield who dies young. The novel was still being published when she died. And Plorn, already accounted for, rabbit inspector, dead in debt in Moree at 49, kept the letter. Here is the second teaser paid off. Kate told Shaw that her father was a very wicked man. What she said next has rarely been quoted. She said, "Why was my father ever a father?" Charles Dickens's physical decline began visibly around 1865, the year of the Staplehurst railway crash. On the 9th of June, 1865, returning from France with Ellen Ternan and her mother, Dickens's train derailed on a bridge under repair in Kent. The first 7 carriages fell into the river below. 10 people were killed. The carriage Dickens occupied was the only first-class carriage to remain on the bridge, hanging, by some accounts, precariously over the edge. He spent 3 hours among the wounded and the dying, dispensing brandy from his flask, filling a hat with river water to cool the faces of those he could not save. Before leaving, he went back to his dangling carriage to retrieve the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend. He developed what he described to friends as sudden vague rushes of terror when travelling by train. His son Henry witnessed him in railway carriages afterward, both hands gripping the seat, pale, barely breathing at the slight jostle of points. The reading tours continued. They were by now less artistic events than physical performances at the edge of capability. In April of 1869, he collapsed in Preston, Lancashire, and was diagnosed with symptoms consistent with what we would now recognise as a series of mild strokes. His doctor cancelled the tour. After some recovery, a final series of 12 readings was arranged for January to March of 1870 at St James's Hall in London. His last public reading was on the 15th of March 1870. He read A Christmas Carol and a trial scene from Pickwick. He was so physically diminished that some in the audience wept, simply watching him walk to the podium. 2 months later, on the 8th of June 1870, he suffered a catastrophic hemorrhage at the dinner table at Gad's Hill. His sister-in-law Georgina Hogarth, the woman who had stayed with the family after Catherine left, who had raised the younger children, who had been the daily fact of domestic life at Gad's Hill for 27 years, was at the table. She asked him to lie down. He said, "On the ground." Those were his last words. He never regained consciousness. He died the following evening, the 9th of June 1870, aged 58. His estate was valued at approximately £93,000, roughly 14 million in contemporary value. He left an annuity to Ellen Ternan, sufficient to make her financially independent. He left £8,000 to Georgina Hogarth and his 2 sons, who assisted with management of his affairs. He confirmed Catherine's annual allowance of £600. The children received shares of the estate and the literary copyrights. The copyrights continued generating income. The children's ability to manage that income varied enormously. Charlie sold the family's writing estate to pay publishing debts. Plorn borrowed £800 and never repaid it. Henry managed well and died prosperous. Gad's Hill Place, the house that the factory boy had dreamed of owning since he was a child walking past it, was sold in 1879. On the morning of the 8th of June, 1870, Charles Dickens spent the day writing in the chalet in the garden at Gad's Hill, the green-painted Swiss-style structure connected to the main house by the tunnel he had built under the road. The windows of the chalet faced south. From them, on clear days, you could see the Thames and, beyond it, the Essex marshes, the marshes he had described in the opening of Great Expectations, the flat, cold place where a convict rises from the grave to frighten a boy named Pip. He was working on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his 15th and final novel, which he would not complete. 6 monthly instalments had been published. The 7th was never written. The mystery at the centre of Edwin Drood, whether or not the title character has been murdered, has never been resolved, because the author died before he could write the resolution. He came in from the chalet at dinner. Georgina Hogarth was at the table. He appeared unwell. He mentioned feeling uncomfortable, and then he said that he must go to London immediately. He pushed back his chair, stood, and fell. Georgina caught him. She asked him to lie down. He said, "On the ground." He sank onto the floor of the dining room. He lay there all night. The doctor came. There was nothing to be done. The next day, the 9th of June, 5 of his children gathered in the house. His daughter Kate arrived from London. Henry was there. Mamie. Charlie had been sent for. Some accounts placed Georgina at the bedside throughout. Ellen Ternan was not present. She could not be. Even now, even in his last hours, her existence required concealment. He died at 6 in the evening, in the dining room of Gad's Hill Place, on a sofa that had been brought in for the purpose. He was 58 years old. His biographer Claire Tomalin has noted that there is compelling evidence he had actually collapsed at his townhouse in Peckham, Ellen's house, and was transported back to Gad's Hill by Ellen's staff in order to protect the secret of the relationship. If true, it is the most elaborately maintained fiction in the history of English literature. Near him on the night he died was, by the accounts of those present, a small stack of manuscript pages, the unfinished Edwin Drood. On the cover page of the final completed installment, Dickens had written, in his small compressed handwriting, a single question mark. Literary scholars have debated its meaning for 150 years. The central symbolic device from the beginning of this story, the letter he wrote to Plorn, the one that said, "These pains must be borne," was written at Gad's Hill, in the same house where he died, in the same room from which he walked to the railway station to not say goodbye to his youngest son. Gad's Hill faced east in the mornings, toward the marshes, toward the beginning. The funeral was held on the 14th of June, 1870, at Westminster Abbey, contrary to Dickens's explicit written wish, which had requested an inexpensive, unostentatious, and strictly private manner of burial in Rochester Cathedral. He had specifically asked for no memorial, no monument, no public ceremony. The nation ignored him. He was buried in Poets' Corner. The Dean of Westminster delivered the memorial address 5 days later. Catherine Dickens, the woman who had borne his 10 children and been publicly expelled from his life, and had spent 20 years keeping his letters safe for posterity, was not at the funeral. She was not invited. She died 9 years later, in 1879. Only then were the letters given to the British Museum, with her note about wanting the world to know he had loved her once. The estate dispersal was rapid, and in some cases chaotic. Charlie inherited all the year round, and managed it for several years before financial pressure forced the sale of Gad's Hill in 1879. Gad's Hill Place passed out of the family entirely, and is now a school, the Charles Dickens School in Higham, Kent. The green chalet where he wrote was given to a friend, transported in pieces, and stands today on the grounds of the Dickens Museum in Rochester, still facing south, still looking toward the marshes. Georgina Hogarth lived until 1917. She received her £8,000, lived quietly, and spent decades curating the Dickens archive with what his biographers generally describe as a protective ferocity. She chose what was preserved. She chose what was described. The version of Charles Dickens that the 19th century received was, in significant part, the version Georgina Hogarth wanted it to have. The literary copyrights generated royalties for decades. Henry managed his share competently. Alfred used his to fund lecture tours. Plorn borrowed against his and lost the money, possibly gambling. Charlie's branch of the family sold what could be sold. And here is the third and final teaser, paid off at last. Robert Gottlieb, editing a 1-volume collection of Dickens' letters in a used bookstore decades later, was struck by how much of the correspondence was about the children. Worried letters, disappointed letters, loving letters, calculating letters, letters of dismissal, and letters of farewell. Dickens wrote more letters about his children, Gottlieb concluded, than about any other subject. He could not stop thinking about them. He simply could not stop sending them away. What was found in Edward Dickens's papers in the State Library of New South Wales, discovered long after his death, preserved among the letters of Sir Henry Parkes, was the original letter from his father. "I need not tell you that I love you dearly. These pains must be borne." Plorn had carried it to Australia at 16, and it had stayed with him through every bankruptcy and drought and lost election for 34 years, until he died in Moree, with nothing much left except the letter and the name. For most of the 100 years following Charles Dickens's death, the official account held. It held because Georgina Hogarth held it, and because the public needed it to hold, and because the alternative, that the man who wrote the most compassionate portraits of abandoned children in the history of English literature was also a man who effectively abandoned his own, was too uncomfortable to fully absorb. The first serious crack came in 1939, when Gladys Story published Dickens and Daughter, a book based on her years of friendship with Kate Perugini. Supporters of Dickens immediately attacked it. What they could not explain away was George Bernard Shaw's letter to the Times Literary Supplement, in which he stated simply that Kate had told him everything in the book 40 years before its publication. The rehabilitation of Catherine came gradually, through the work of scholars like Michael Slater, and then definitively through Lillian Nader's 2011 biography, the first full account of Catherine's life, which established that she was highly capable, deeply loved by her children, and subjected to a campaign of reputation destruction conducted by one of the most skilled propagandists in the history of the language. The most heartbreaking document to emerge from this reappraisal is not a letter or a diary, but a fact of custody. When Charles Dickens separated from Catherine, he insisted that the children remain with him. He then proceeded to send 5 of the 7 sons to distant postings from which most would die abroad. The daughters he kept close became, in various ways, the casualties of a household organised around his genius and his will. Mamie drank. Kate buried her only child at 7 months and painted children for the rest of her life, and both of them tended his legacy with a care and devotion that he had never fully extended to them. What the press called Dickens's eccentric domestic difficulties was, in fact, a set of human consequences that lasted for 3 generations. Monica Dickens, Henry's granddaughter, became a novelist and wrote, late in her career, about what it meant to carry that name and the specific gravity it contained. What Kate Dickens called wickedness was not, in the modern reassessment, precisely wickedness. It was something harder to prosecute, the inability of a man of enormous imaginative empathy to turn that empathy fully onto the people he had most reason to see clearly. He could feel the suffering of Oliver Twist with complete precision. He could not feel the suffering of Plorn on the platform at Heirs Station, not enough to walk down and stand there. What you have called the story of Dickens the father, Claire Tomalin wrote in her biography, published in 2011, is really the story of what happens when a person's imagination is large enough to see the whole world, and too narrow, in the end, to accommodate the specific faces of those who loved him most. Remember the thesis we established at the beginning of this story. This is not a story about Charles Dickens the writer. This is a story about what it costs to be magnificent. And who pays? Return with me to the 26th of September, 1868. Heirs Station, Kent. A 16-year-old boy in a railway carriage, pale and crying, composing himself as best he can. His brother Henry is beside him. Their father is not there. Their father sent a letter. The letter says, among other careful things, I hope you will always be able to say in afterlife that you had a kind father. It was the same letter that ended, "These pains must be borne." We have spent this whole time circling that document. We can see it now as what it actually was, not a letter from a father to a son, but a letter from a man to his own terror. Charles Dickens grew up terrified of becoming his father, a genial, debt-ridden, charming man who could not hold money or direction or family together, who ended up in the Marshalsea prison, who put his 12-year-old son in a rat-filled warehouse and left him there. The terror of becoming that man drove everything: the novels, the readings, the relentless productivity, the control of every piece of furniture in every room before he could begin writing, the dispatching of sons who showed any resemblance to the man he feared most. He failed. Not at the novels. The novels are among the greatest works of literature produced in the English language, and there is no serious argument otherwise. He failed at the thing the novels kept promising was possible: the redeemable family, the saved child, the opened door. Charlie died at 59, having sold the house his father loved. Mary died the same year, having never married, having spent her life managing someone else's legacy. Kate lived to 89, and told the truth when she could, and painted the children she had lost, and said plainly that they had all been wicked not to take their mother's part. Walter died talking about home. Sydney died in the Indian Ocean. Frank died in Illinois between lectures about his father. Alfred died in New York, between lectures about his father. Plorn died in Moree, having worked as a rabbit inspector, having lost his station, having never repaid the loan, having kept the letter. Dora Annie Dickens died at 4 months. Her name was taken from a character in her father's novel. The character in the novel also dies young. Henry Fielding Dickens, the one his father spared from criticism, became a knight and died at 84. His granddaughter Monica Dickens became a writer. The gift skipped a generation. It usually does. The letter that Plorn kept for 34 years in the Australian outback, the one that said, "These pains must be borne," said in its final line, "I hope you will always be able to say in afterlife that you had a kind father." He kept it, all the way to the end. That is the only answer we have to what it cost. He kept it.